What is the difference between a bishop and an elder? This is a question that has come up to me many times. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at this from both the scripture standpoint. What does the Bible say are the differences between a bishop and an elder? Secondly, we're going to look at the words itself. What does the word bishop and elder actually mean? And then finally, we're going to look at it from a historical point of view. How did these offices work together historically after the apostles had died? So let's take a look at bishop and elder from a scriptural standpoint. We find these two offices mentioned primarily by the Apostle Paul in his pastoral letters. And we find the word elder also mentioned in Peter's letter in 1 Peter chapter 5. Now, when you read Paul's writings about bishop and elder, you really don't see any particular distinction between the two. They seem to be used interchangeably. So to know the difference between the two, we really cannot look at scriptures to see its differences, its nuances, okay? So that's the first thing. But of course, there's a good reason why you don't see a distinction between a bishop and an elder, because in the end, all bishops are elders, but not all elders are bishops, okay? Now, we're going to look at bishop and elder from the Greek. What do these words mean? Let's take a look at the word elder first. The word elder is the Greek word presbyter, and it is the root for the word priest. In fact, listen to the word presbyter. It sounds like priest. Priestaber. In other words, that word elder was taken from the Old Testament priesthood of Israel. And those priests were called elders. So we find the Apostle Paul actually using an Old Testament term of elders and bringing it into the New Testament. So what were the Old Testament elders? They were the priests that offered the sacrifices. They were also the ones who kind of led Israel. And if you were in the Sanhedrin, you were a special elder where you were making decisions for the nation of Israel. So you were a priest. Now, that means an elder is a priest. Now, that brings some difficulty for some Christians, because we also know that all Christians are priests. Are we not? We all have direct access to God. You don't need to receive forgiveness through a human mediator, because Christ is our high priest. He is our mediator. So we don't need human beings to be our mediator for us. We can receive forgiveness from God. We can receive healing. Our prayers can be answered directly from us to God. Yet that doesn't mean the New Testament has abandoned the role of priests as ministers. For even James writes in James chapter 5, is any among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church. Why doesn't he say just call for any Christian to pray for them? No, he calls for the elders, which meant they understood that while all believers are priests, there is still a specific role for those who are called to be in the ministry full time. And those would be the ministry or minister priest. Isaiah chapter 61 mentions the new covenant. It says, and they will be called priests of the Lord. They shall be named ministers of our God. Notice the two terms, priest and ministers. See, many Protestants have no trouble with calling their pastor a minister. But listen to me, your pastor is also a priest. In fact, all ministers that are full-time are priests. Whether they're an evangelist, a pastor, a teacher, a prophet, they're also priests. So all ministers ordained are elders or priests of Christ. So that brings us then to the word bishop. The word bishop actually means overseer. And in that word, we see that they would be in charge just by virtue of that name, overseer. That is, they are overseeing the other elders. You see this? They're overseeing their work. So we see just in the word itself, the bishop would have oversight over those other ministers. Now, we do not see any particular teaching from the apostles how a bishop is supposed to run versus an elder. Why? Because the apostles were alive at the time. If you had a question, you had a question of theology, you had a question on practical Christian living, if an apostle said one thing and a bishop said another, guess who you listen to? You listen to the apostles. Because as long as the apostles were alive, the church was ruled by the apostles. But it became quite clear by the end of the first century, all the original apostles would have died off. So who's going to lead the church? So that's when the apostolic fathers explain, primarily Clement does this, who actually was a disciple of the Apostle John. And he explains that the role that if you were ordained as a bishop directly by an apostle, you were the successors of those apostles. So when the apostles passed away, you continue in their authority. So the bishops had that authority. And those ministers that were not directly ordained by an apostle, they were considered the elders or presbyters or priests who function as ministers, though they did not have the same authority as the bishops did. For the bishops were ordained directly by an apostle. You can imagine, if you were ordained directly by an apostle, you had apostolic authority. Do you see this? But then it became crystal clear by the end of the 2nd century, the 3rd century, there were going to be no direct apostles who had been ordained by an apostle. And that's when the church came up through the guidance of the Spirit that these bishops had to continue this succession by ordaining other bishops. But since they're not an apostle, they would have to need another bishop or 3 altogether to ordain other bishops. So if you were a bishop that were living in the 1st or early 2nd century, you realize you needed to continue this apostolic succession. Otherwise, the church would die off. We would not have leaders of the church to make important decisions for the church, like when do we celebrate Easter, Passover, all these other things that the church, Christmas, and all of these things. When are we going to do all of these things? So we're going to need the bishops to guide us. But that's when the bishops recognize that it's provided they have at least 2 or 3 bishops ordaining someone, that person could also be a bishop, and they would have the authority to ordain others. But only bishops would have that. And so the difference between a bishop and a modern day elder is elders can do everything that a bishop can do except for one thing. They cannot ordain other ministers.